Well, thanks, Molly, and thanks for everyone who's come to the meeting this afternoon. You see, when you put a bit of pressure on, you get reform. That's an important lesson to take away from the meeting if you learn nothing else. I'm going to start by saying something which will shock you. I think the election was a very bad result for the Labour Party. And now people will say, Charlie, did you watch the elections? Or maybe you should have had a few hours more sleep than you did last night. Haven't you seen what happened? And certainly it's true that we have witnessed the destruction of the Conservative Party in Parliament. The beginning of what passes for democracy in Britain begins in 1832, where after decades of resistance by ordinary people, including burning down Nottingham Castle, seizing the centre of Bristol and holding it for 3 days, and many similar events, the Parliament passed a reform to allow more people to have a vote. No women, of course, and only 1 in 7 men. Nonetheless, that's regarded as the beginning of democracy in Britain. The election was a disaster for the Conservatives after that, led by the Duke of Wellington, a man even richer than Rishi Sunak, probably. They were nearly wiped out, 175 seats, terrible result, seen as one of the most appalling results for the Conservative Party. Then you move to 1906. 1906, the split in the Tories over the question of free trade. And in 1906, they were reduced to 156 seats. The low point of the Conservative Party in history. And this time, they're going to get lower than either of those two landmarks. They're going to get lower than either of those two landmarks, and Liz Truss lost a seat. That was a great moment. And the seats previously held by Theresa May, by Boris Johnson, by David Cameron, and by Margaret Thatcher were all lost by the Conservative Party. That's how deep it went last night. Their votes went down from 44% to 24%. 20 percentage points down. And now what will follow is a zoological struggle amongst the remaining Tory MPs to decide who will now set the tone and be the leader of the Conservatives in the future. So how is it possible? Because obviously there's another side to this, isn't there, to talk about the failures of the Labour Party. Because if the Tories did badly, Labour did incredibly well. 410 seats out of 650, that is a massive majority for the Labour Party. And Keir Starmer is seen as the king of electoral achievement, having dragged the party back from the doldrums into which Corbyn had plunged it. And then you have to start asking the questions. I've been boring people for several weeks to say, let's see if Starmer gets as many votes as Corbyn did in 2017. 2017, 12.8 million. Let's see if Starmer gets 13 million votes or not. You know, I was completely wrong to put that as the comparator. Completely wrong. The comparator was not Corbyn in 2017. The comparator is Corbyn in 2019. 2019, when they were virtually wiped out electorally, Starmer is going to get fewer votes than Labour got in 2019. Fewer votes than 2019. And then you begin to look at the sorts of reasons people gave for voting for the Labour Party. The reason, there was a poll on the eve of the election, YouGov, big poll, proper poll, serious poll, asked people who were going to vote Labour, why are you voting Labour? 48% of them said to get the Tories out, good reason. Now the 14%, because we need change. Getting the Tories out in another guise, in truth. Because I like the policies of the Labour Party. 5%. 5%. Because I like the leadership of Keir Starmer. 1%. Not making it up. I'm not making up. It's the truth. The truth. The truth. And John Curtis, that elections expert, said that were it not for the fact that Labour did very well in Scotland, and they did do well in Scotland, and by the way, I haven't really time to go into it, but virtually wiped out the Scottish National Party and its failed strategy of trying to achieve independence. Had it not been for Scotland, he said there would have been a lower vote in 2019, but there was a vote, actually. The vote in Wales was down, and the vote in England is stagnant or slightly smaller than it was in 2019. Now, that tells you there is absolutely no enthusiasm for the Labour government. There is mass enthusiasm for getting rid of the Tories. And some feel, let's not overstate it, some feel of hope that we can turn a page on what's happened. But the hope isn't going to come through what the Labour government will now do. And I want to say that we now face a very serious threat and also a locus of hope in the situation moving forward. The threat is obvious, it's Reform UK. If the Labour vote didn't go up and the Tory vote slumped, where did the votes go? Very large numbers of them, 4 million votes, went to Reform UK. Now, thank goodness it wasn't what that exit poll said last night, as we all gathered round our televisions and went, oh my goodness, 13 Reform MPs. No, but nonetheless be clear, 14% of the vote, 4 million votes, 4 MPs, is still serious. Still very, very serious. It builds upon, of course, years and decades of state racism and of pandering to anti-migrant sentiment and pushing through the most vicious racist and Islamophobic laws by the Tories and supported in nearly every case by the Labour Party as well. That's where that vote comes from. Wrapping the real grievances that people have about housing and wages and jobs and the NHS, wrapping it around a racist agenda. And the Tories did it, Labour accepted it, and Reform have harvested the result of that. And one of the things we have to go away from this is we need a big campaign against all forms of racism and fascism. And if you haven't seen it on social media or anything at the moment, fantastic that Stand Up to Racism this afternoon invaded Nigel Farage's press conference and guidance the final of resistance. Look at the film of it. It's heartening. It's heartening. And we're going to need a lot more of it. And we need the biggest possible turnout on Saturday, the 27th of July in London, to block fascist Tommy Robinson as part of the process of undermining racism North End. This is not a 5-minute struggle. It's never a 5-minute struggle once these people get a foothold. It's a difficult, long struggle, as it has been, with comrades like Wayman and many others involved in fighting back all the different iterations of racism and fascism. We've beaten them before, and we can beat them again if we turn out on the 27th and carry it out afterwards. But it also means not simply those national set-piece confrontations. It also means building Stand Up to Racism in every area that you come from, in every city and town, in making sure there is a functioning group to push back against the racists and stop them building any further. And in doing that, although it's frightening, although it's scary, although we know it's part of a European pattern, we can see it in France with the Rassemblement National of Marine Le Pen and Jordan Bardella knocking on the gates of power in France for the second round of the elections this weekend. Although there is that happening in Italy and Germany and Austria and many other countries of the world as well, there is also the potential for the left to build as well. And, you know, we saw that last night as well. 5 independent candidates, pro-Palestine, fighting against the genocide in Gaza, elected, and several others nearly elected as well. Iqbal Mohammed in Dewsbury, Shaukat Adam in Leicester, beating the Labour shadow cabinet John Ashley. Ayub Khan in Birmingham, Adnan Hussain in Blackburn, the fifth one, Jeremy Corbyn in Islington North. And, you know, they are a reflection of that incredible movement which has existed for 9 months and put 3.5 million people on the streets for Palestine. No Palestine movement, no victories last night. And there could have been more. My goodness, how close we were to Liam Mohammed beating Wes Streeting in Ilford North. Would that not have been a sweet moment to have seen Streeting? And by the way, she lost by just over 500 votes. I hope the Greens are proud that they took 1,500 in that constituency. If the Greens hadn't stood, Liam Mohammed would be the MP for Ilford North now. So for all those people, and I haven't really time to go into it, I recognise that people do vote for the Greens sometimes because of Gaza, because of pressing environmental questions, because they're seen as having better policies than Labour, which, to be honest, they do often have better policies than the Labour Party. Nonetheless, I don't think they're the solution. I don't think they're the answer for what we need, a pro-NATO party which has largely run away from the questions of Gaza. And therefore, the hope really is in the mood that those 5 and several others represented as well. And let's remember Maxine Bolo, comrade in the Socialist Workers' Party. 8% of the vote in Sheffield. Very, very impressive that she did that with very little time to build a campaign and to know that she was running, and others as well. Michael Lavalette, for example, in Preston, old friend of ours, 22% of the vote. Fantastic achievement in Preston. And several others that I could mention. Now, that doesn't automatically turn into some form of new movement, but it tells us that there is a potential to build on the left in Britain in a much, much more serious way than there was before. When Blair was elected in 1997, there was nothing of that sort. We began to patch it together quite soon afterwards, and it exploded in the anti-war movement after 2003. We're already much more advanced than that. And I don't think the solution is about elections. I don't think it's about simply creating some sort of electoral form. I don't think that's the answer at all. But I do know that the left has to get its act together. Because really we should have had 100 or 120 or 150 candidates across Britain as part of a real electoral challenge. And had we done that, then maybe we would look much more like Reform UK, and we would be the news this morning rather than Nigel Farage being the news. And the reason why that didn't happen is because it wasn't launched when there was the chance to do it. I've said it before, but it's still true. If Jeremy Corbyn had stood up on the 11th of November 2023 when he spoke in front of a million people on the Palestine demo, and said, Palestine's going to be on the ballot paper, and not just Palestine, compassion towards refugees, fight against austerity, for women's rights, for action on the climate. I'm standing against Labour, and I want 100 people to stand with me against the Labour Party. He would have had a national movement with his eye 3 months. And it would have changed things. It would have changed things. And he didn't do it because of the dead hand of Labourism that says there isn't really life outside the Labour Party. Now they kicked Jeremy Corbyn out of the Labour Party. He was forced to campaign outside the Labour Party. But far too much, even of that campaign, which I was involved in, which many comrades were involved in, was quite defensive in truth. Quite defensive about the issue of Palestine, and quite defensive about the issue of the Labour Party. Not really going for Starmer's throat until right at the end, it got better. And I think that actually was one of the reasons why Corbyn won. And thank goodness he did win. It is an achievement for the whole of the left that he won. But we need much more than campaigns which are about individuals or campaigns which are about trying to get back inside the Labour Party. We need something that's much more serious. And the reason I say that is because there are big issues that are coming in front of us. We know that the Labour government is not going to produce presents for the working class. Starmer was very clear about this, wasn't he? You know, the whole thing was he was holding this Ming vase and taking it across the room. Don't fuck it up here. Don't fuck it up. Don't drop the Ming vase. Don't drop the Ming vase. And the Ming vase was all about, I'm going to bring stability. I'm going to bring a nice, calm environment for big business. For big business. We are going to get growth in the economy. How are we going to get growth? We're going to throw presents to big business. And the concomitant of that is there's not going to be lots more money for the National Health Service. There'll be a little bit more money. Of course there will. But it'll be about, even on their own plans, about a fifth of what Tony Blair gave as an increase to the National Health Service. Now, lots of the Blair money went to private firms. I know that. You know, PFI and all that nonsense. But Starmer is much, much lower than that. There's not going to be any big increase for public sector workers. There's probably some teachers in the room. Very soon, the STRB, the review body for teachers, is going to come back and it's going to make a recommendation to the government. I'll tell you, it's not going to be 10% rise. And it's not going to be a 10% rise from Starmer. There's an early test. There's an early test for the unions. Starmer is committed, if you work through enough layers of the manifesto. It doesn't actually say this in the manifesto, but it refers to another document which refers to something else. They are committed to getting rid of the 2016 Trade Union Act. The 2016 Trade Union Act is the one that lays down ballot thresholds for strikes, you know, the 50% for strike and all that. Now, my guess is that they're not going to rush to do that. They're not going to rush to do that. And of course, it does say we're going to have lots of consultation before we do that with bosses. Mr. Moneybags, what do you think about getting rid of strike ballot thresholds? Oh, they don't like it. They don't like it. And some trade union leaders don't like it as well, by the way, because it's quite useful for some trade union leaders. Oh, we'd love to have a strike, you know, but unfortunately we didn't hit the threshold, so stay at work. So my guess is that will be a fight. It'll be a big fight inside the trade union movement. And there's a big fight as well about the question of war, because Starmer is a signed-up supporter of imperialism. I mean, he passed the test. It's a great test for every Labour leader. Where do you stand on the question of Israel? Where do you stand on the question? Why? because it's the litmus test of imperialism. Are you for the little loyal Jewish Ulster in a sea of potentially hostile Arabism, as Ronald Storrs, the governor of Jerusalem, put it? Are you in favour of the outpost of the West in the Middle East? And if you don't pass that test, we will destroy you, as they tried to do with Corbyn. And Starmer has passed it, and he has signed up on that, and he's signed up on the question of the Ukraine war, and he's signed up on the question of more money for the generals. Far bigger increase for the generals and the spies and the cops than there is for the National Health Service. Far bigger increase. And therefore, we are going to have a fight from day one. When we have, on Socialist Worker, fight Starmer from day one, it's because we recognise that this government is not an ally of the working class. It's not a slightly errant friend who can be beckoned over to our side. This government is going to be an enemy of the working class. And it's very important that we argue that you have to recognise that they are going to try and hold down the level of wages. They're going to try and hold down the level of public expenditure. They're going to try and restrict how many workers' rights they give out. And they're going to do it in the interests of capital and the interests of imperialism. And therefore, we need resistance against it. And then you have to look at the past. And the past is interesting. I wrote an article in Socialist Worker. You can read it if you haven't read it already, pages 14 and 15 in this week's issue, about what it's like when a Labour government gets into office, particularly the 74-79 government. Because the 74-79 government came into office after the most extraordinary explosion of workers' struggles between 70 and 74. Between 70 and 72, there were an average of 2 factory occupations a week. 2 factory occupations a week. Workers didn't just go on strike. They took over the factory. Now, we'd be delighted if we got 1 a month, 1 every 6 months, whatever. Well, 2 a week between 70 and 72. And then the miners' strike defeated the Tories in 72. And then the miners again defeated the Tories in 74, forced the election and forced the Tories out of office. Essentially, the miners brought down the Tory government. And there was a near general strike over the anti-union laws and getting people out of Pentonville, for those who remember. It's an extraordinary time. And the Labour government came into office, and its first act was to force through what became the social contract. The social contract, which held wages 10% below the level of inflation. And the Labour Chancellor, Dennis Healey, said, "It's my greatest boast. It's extraordinary. The TUC General Council, the leader of the trade unions, have agreed to this, and I don't think there's ever been an example in history where this has happened in the same way." And they held wages down for 3 years. 3 years they held the wages down. If you look at it's very, very interesting. You learn a lot about reformism from these things. Between 70 and 74, wages go up like this, even though there's a Tory government, because people fought. Then Labour gets in and wages go like that. The biggest fall in wages up until the 2007-2008 financial crisis, because the Labour government crushed resistance. What matters is not who's sitting in number 10 Downing Street. What matters is the level of resistance. And therefore, we are called upon to be the people who are at the heart of resistance. And I think you have to speak to 2 different audiences. There's one audience of people who think you probably have to give them a bit of time, the Labour government, Not quite sure when you say they're the enemy. I'm really glad we got rid of the Tories. So, don't go over the top, Charlie. But they will think, those people, I agree with you, we ought to get rid of the 2-child benefit cap. That's a very basic, nasty bit of Tory legislation that the Labour government could get rid of. It means 275,000 children would be lifted out of poverty. That's a stroke if they did that. Very easy thing to do. But they don't want to do it because it's a bit of a symbol. It's a bit of a symbol to Starmer and Rachel Reeves and so on. Look, we're tough. We're standing up to the left. I mean, Starmer again was clear about this. Why do you have to be so nasty to the left? Why do you have to be so nasty? Removing candidates. Faiza Shaheen in Chingford. She would have won last night. You know, her and the Labour candidate, because she was removed, stood as an independent. Labour ran another candidate. Together, their vote is far more than the bloody loathsome Ian Duncan Smith, who survives because of the removal of Faiza Shaheen as the candidate. A disgusting manoeuvre. But why did they do it? Because they want to show that when it comes to the tough decisions, as they always put it, though it's not tough for them, is it? Not tough for them on their inflation-linked pay and their fat pensions and their expenses and the nice conditions they have. It's not tough for them. But they want to show that they can be ruthless when it's necessary. And therefore, it's going to take resistance and a fight back in order to do it. And we have to learn the lesson from 74, 79, that will also take struggle against trade union leaders. It will also take pushing back against the argument, it's our government, don't fight, you only get the Tories back. The truth is this: if you don't fight, there will be a growing bitterness inside society. We got rid of the Tories because we wanted to turn the page on 14 years of brutal class war against working class people and our lives being crushed and constrained by the Conservatives. We wanted to turn the page on that. And then we discover it's no better under Labour, and for lots of people, it's actually worse under Labour. And what do you think the mood in society will be? It will be bitter, and it can go all over the place. And it means that you can get another 2, 3, 4 million votes for reform next time. And more importantly, you could get an atmosphere of witch hunting, of scapegoating, of racist attacks, of attacks on Muslim women, and so on. That's what will happen unless the left puts forward an alternative. You see, I think there's often a fatalism about this, a fatalism. Labour's in office, Labour's going to attack the working class, they're going to continue with the wars, and the right will grow, and the fascists will grow and get bigger, and so on. Okay, that is one scenario. That is one scenario. It's a real scenario, okay? But here's another scenario. The bitterness grows against Labour. The level of strikes goes up. The level of strikes goes up and the level of campaigning goes up. And we have a vibrant anti-racist movement. And we have a socialist movement. And we have a Palestine movement. And we continue the agitation over the attacks against trans people and for women's rights and over the question of environmental collapse. We do all that, and instead of the mood being garnered by the racists and the far right, it ends up building a bigger socialist force in society which could not simply push back against Nigel Farage, but can lay the basis for an entirely different sort of society. And that's possible. That's possible. And actually, our responsibility is from the minute we leave Marxism to be those who are pushing for that to be the result of the Labour government. And we need a bigger left, we need a better left, we need a left that is building on the streets and the workplaces, not obsessed with what goes on in Parliament. And that is our responsibility, individually and collectively, to begin building all of the different elements of that. And we should do it suffused with hope because of last night. Because we did put Palestine on the ballot paper, even though they didn't want us to. We did push back against the Labour Party and against the Tories and against Reform UK. And we're not going to stop the struggle now. You see, I think quite rightly people say it's a bit like the 1930s, isn't it? bit like the 1930s. For quite a long time, we talked about Tony Cliff, founder of the Socialist Workers' Party's phrase, the 1930s in slow motion. And then at various points, we've said, it's speeded up, you know. It's speeded up. It certainly feels it's speeding up now. But what do you know about the 1930s? You ask me, what happened in the 1930s? And if you learn at school, what happened in the 1930s? 1933, Adolf Hitler came to power. It meant the full development and entrenchment of Mussolini's fascist regime in Italy. True. Franco won the Spanish Civil War and implemented a vile regime of police dictatorship and attacks on the left and mass murder in the Spanish state. All of that's true, by the way. But what you don't learn at school is it was also the period when the Spanish workers drove out the monarchy in 1931 by general strike. And in 1936, when Franco first tried to take over, large parts of Spain was taken over by armed workers and peasants who occupied the land and the factories and sometimes collectivized it. And then they were beaten back. You don't learn that in 1934, in February, 5 million workers went up against the far right and fascists and called a general strike and hurled them back. Or that in 1936, they elected a Popular Front government amid some of the biggest revolutionary strikes that had existed up to that point in France. You don't learn that in America, in the 1930s, there were the three great strikes in San Francisco and Toledo and Minneapolis. And in the Flint sit-down strike, for 70 days, people took over the factory, had 5,000 armed workers stood outside defending it. When the cops came to attack it, even though 13 workers were hospitalized by the police, they fought them back with fire hoses and then threw 2-pound bolts at them to drive the cops off. You don't learn that. In other words, the 1930s was a time when history hung in the balance. History hung in the balance. We are never going to get from here to socialism without an extremely rocky ride, because there will be a time of turmoil, of political and economic and social turmoil. And in that time, the far right can grow and the left can grow. The centre will not hold. The centre will not hold in that situation, and we are the people who have to be part of making sure that the result of this is the victory of our side, not the victory of the racists. This is what the Starmer government puts on the table for us. And it begins with what may seem small things. It means being on the streets on the 27th of July against Robinson. It means in our trade unions raising the argument for struggle. It means keeping the agitation going for every little fight inside the working class. It means pushing at the Labour government. It means being on the streets tomorrow to keep the struggle over Palestine going and not backing off for freedom for the Palestinian people. It means making sure that we leave nobody behind. I wrote an article about George Galloway, and I don't think George Galloway is in any sense the solution for the problems we face. And the reason is because a politics that says, I'm for freedom for Palestine, but I'm throwing refugees and trans people under the bus and allowing them to be scapegoated and attacked is no future for the left at all. And I am delighted. I am delighted that the independents elected last night had much better politics than that. Much better politics than that. So look, it's a big task. It's a big task, and we're all aware of the dangers that are inherent inside the situation. But we should also see there is an immense possibilities here as well. The possibilities of moving beyond a period in which we've been held back by the belief that all you need to do is get Labour elected. Well, now let's see. Let's see what the Labour Party is like in office. Let's see what they deliver. Let's understand that they don't deliver for working class people. And when that happens, let's make sure that it's the left that wins out and not the right. There raised the question of Andrew Feinstein. Sorry, I'm talking about Andrew Feinstein, particularly as he's coming here on Sunday afternoon. It'd be a very good meeting to meet some of the candidates and talk to them about the experience and how we move forward afterwards. Andrew Feinstein got more votes than I thought he would, I must say. To get 7,000 votes against the person that everyone thought was going to be the Prime Minister is a really considerable achievement. It shows how deep the dissolution goes in between. Starmer's majority was cut in, Starmer's vote was cut in half. I mean, it's not a great look for an incoming Prime Minister, to be honest. It also meant that Corbyn got more votes than Starmer. That tells us something about the mood in society. So go to the meeting at 2:00 on Sunday and let's be part of this discussion, which Maxine and Claudia Webb and others will be at as well. The question of campaigning against Farage and against the fascists, you see, I don't think it's exactly the same. I don't think you treat the fascists exactly the same as you treat Farage, and that's why we're stressing very much the 27th of July and so on. But I do also know that we have to build a long-term campaign in order to push back against reform, because it won't be easy to just knock them over. For example, while I was sitting in this meeting, unfortunately, I got the message that Reform had just won their 5th seat in Basildon. They won it by 98 votes. If we had a big stand up to racism in Essex, which could have campaigned against them for 5 weeks, I think we would have stopped them winning it. And that would have involved relentless propaganda about them. It would have been mobilising the trade union movement. It would be mobilising the Palestine movement in the area. It would have been constantly thinking of how you do this, because the national confrontations are absolutely key, but it also requires local activity in order to push back against these people and to argue with people. To argue with people that our problems are not refugees, are not migrants, are not Muslims. They're the rich and the corporations and the politicians who support them. And if you don't have that argument, you're reduced really to liberal moralism, to simply say these people are horrible. And that's true, and you have to show how vile and racist they are. But really the strongest argument is that our side needs to be united against the rich and against big business. And if we drive divisions through it on the basis of race or religion or belief or where people come from, we are letting those people off the hook. That's how racism works in society. It works to set working class people against one another rather than working class people uniting against those at the top. It provides fake enemies as a diversion from the real enemies of the working class. And therefore, I'm glad people spoke so much about the anti-racist movement. It is absolutely central. But we also need to talk about the other elements of class struggle. Because every time that we have a strike or a protest or a campaign or a massive Palestine demo or an activity around trans rights or around the question of the environment, every time we do that, we produce a collective unity which cuts against the divisions that are put forward by the racists. Not that it's automatic that class struggle sidelines the racists. I mean, in France, they've just been through 12 great days of struggle against the pensions reforms, millions on the streets and against the, and on strike in some cases. And yet, the fascist vote is higher than it was before that began. And that's because they don't have a specific anti-racist movement which is broad enough and big enough to push back against the fascists and to seize the moment, to sideline them at the moments of high-class struggle. And to be honest, we have to do it now, because it's much, much harder when, like Rassemblement National, the National Rally, has 10, 11, 12 million votes. It's very hard to push back against them. All power to the French comrades and the French movement that's trying to do this. But it's much tougher than if you start now to push back against these people. And that's one of the things, surely, that we have to learn. And we do need a united front, which everyone is welcome to on one condition, that they are prepared to be active, to take part in action against reform and against the fascists, that they're prepared to be on the streets, to argue in the workplace, to be part of a movement which takes them on. That's the sort of movement that we need to build. Final point, and that is, I talked about the 1930s and how history hung in the balance at that time. And it was resolved in favour of the fascists because the revolutionary moments were missed and the chance for workers' unity were missed because of the politics of the Social Democrats and the suicidal policies of the Communist Party at the time as well. And in other words, the absence of a revolutionary organisation is not simply a nice add-on to all the other movements in which we're involved. The building of a revolutionary organisation is central to making those movements effective and seizing the moment when the time comes. Such a moment is in front of us now. And we are too small in the Socialist Workers' Party to be as effective as we ought to be. And therefore, for all the other things that we've spoken about this afternoon, it is also crucial that all of us are determined to build a bigger revolutionary organisation, which can be the revolutionary socialist spine to all the movements that we so desperately need. And that's why you should join us.